We've just had this major jaw-dropping massacre in Texas. And unfortunately, it raises all kinds of issues, as it always does in the U.S. when these things happen. And the argument is very low quality. But it is also a case in which many people who, at the very least, have failed to challenge nonsense that's been advanced under one team's banner are now very loudly proclaiming logical conclusions that do not follow and have been crippled by the arguments that they themselves have at least tolerated, if not made.
You want to spell that out?
Yeah. So to the extent that you have participated in the demonizing of the police, right? The phony belief that the police are a net bringer of violence, right? We all know that there is police violence and that that's very bad. And I think we all know that it could be less than it is substantially. And certainly some of it will have a racial component, though I don't think we know how much, and it's not nearly as much as portrayed. But to the extent that the BLM riots involved the claim that all cops were bastards. And in many places, including Portland, where we live, the argument was made that the police are not even deserving of the right to live, right? The murder of police was actually called for regularly in graffiti and elsewhere, and this was tolerated. What was also tolerated were attacks on police stations. As I described in an earlier stream that we did, there are still police stations in Portland that have just simply been boarded up, and the broken glass, hangs in the atrium, and the atrium is dark because it's all plywooded over. So that is the environment we have built around policing. And now we are in a situation where we are looking at this massacre and we are saying, what is the implication for the right to own firearms in the U.S.? Right? We're looking at that implication, and we are looking at the police, and we are saying, what should have happened here? And I don't actually know how much you have looked at what the incident in Uvalde was and what the police response was and what people are increasingly troubled by. Is it a story you've been looking at in depth?
Not in depth, no.
So there is this very long period after the police are on the scene in which they're taking no action. And I think in the end, when we finally know all of the things that took place, it will turn out that that was clearly a terrible error that had dire consequences. That said, all of the people that I hear critiquing this do not appear to be careful about what environment it is that police are doing policing in. And I thought it made sense.
It's very easy to imagine that after the fact, we know exactly what everyone should have done. And after years of having their jobs and livelihoods demonized, being told now, well, obviously this time you should have acted fast. It seems like probably they should have. But just yesterday, just last week, just a month ago, just a year ago, these same people were being demonized and actually advised that they should die.
Right. And, it's different in Texas. On the other hand, we're all participating in a national environment in which these things were frequently said. And, here in Portland, as in Seattle and San Francisco and Los Angeles, there's a notable lack of policing. And mostly it is people's habit of obeying the law that is continuing to maintain order. But, you demonize the police, and at some point they listen to you. And it has reduced their enthusiasm for enforcing the law. Now, I don't think that that's what happened in Texas. But I just want to lay out, a scenario, just so that people at least have something to, put a guardrail on their tendency to just say, well, obviously, I think it's 19 kids and 2 teachers died, and there was this long period of time in which the shooter was unchallenged inside the school. Obviously, that should have been different. But let's suppose that the police had rushed in. And let's suppose that an officer had shot the gunman and only 10 children had died, but the police officer had shot 1 child and a teacher in the process. Now, trolley problem-wise, that's better, right?
but we can't know both futures.
Right. That had that happened, we would now be talking about what had gone wrong in the police response, that children and teachers were caught in the crossfire.
Right? In some quarters, that policeman would now be being called a murderer.
Something. What if the police officer was white and the teacher was Hispanic, right? What added situation what added spin is this going to add to the fury over what went wrong in Uvalde, right? Mm-hmm. So, there is a principle called qualified immunity, which is supposed to give police knowledge of their own security so that they can do what's right. And if it doesn't go well, effectively, it's a good Samaritan provision, but for professionals. Mm-hmm. The problem is, I don't know what the state of this thing is now. Right? I don't know that in an environment where the blue team is actually championing the idea.
In this case, blue stands for Democrats, not police.
Right. That's a good distinction. Yes. When I say the blue team, I mean the Democratic Party is cynically partnered with a mob that is actively demonizing police, that is imposing racist interpretations on all sorts of unfortunate scenarios that don't have a racial component. And so the point is that cannot help but arrive with the police, right?
I'm reminded actually of an article written by a new friend of mine, Alana Redstone, that I wrote about in Natural Selections a couple of weeks ago, in which she tells a story. She's apologies, Dr. Redstone, I think a sociologist at University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign. And she asks her students, if a reasonable person could understand what happened to George Floyd without invoking a racial component. And at first she is surprised that the responses come back, like 60% of her students are like, yeah, a reasonable person could understand what happened there without invoking racism, basically. But then it turns out through further questioning that what is hiding in reasonable person in the students' heads is because they're ignorant. Because, reasonable people can be ignorant, but if they knew what I know, then that number, the percentage of students who actually thinks that you can understand that scene, that whole terrible thing that happened almost exactly 2 years ago now, could not be understood without framing it in racial terms, goes, and I don't remember what the numbers are, but far, far lower. And so, that is the environment into which now, 2 years later, this happens, but our entire world has, and since before George Floyd, of course, the explicitly racialized context in which we are expected to engage all of our fellow human beings, as brought to us by, frankly, charlatans like Ibram X. Kendi and Robin DiAngelo, with their best-selling books that have told us that if we don't focus on race at all times, we are ourselves actively being racist by doing so, when in fact it's exactly the opposite, has created a world in which, how could you not hesitate if you are about to go in and try to help someone and there's a possibility that you're trying to help might not be perfect, and you then might be accused of doing exactly the harm that you are absolutely opposed to in the world.
Yeah, we have effectively created a minefield where the legal environment and the social condemnation mirror the predicament that we all face online, where we know that basically the terms of service cannot be followed. Right? You will find out after the fact what the rules were, right? Because somebody will throw an interpretation on the terms of service that puts you over them. So I'm not saying I think it's obvious to me that you had a lot of well-armed cops who were there well before the shooting stopped, right? I think they should have maneuvered a vehicle. I mean, we got to remember this guy had an AR-15. I don't know what the walls were made of, but they can certainly go through almost anything that they would have. So even just approaching the building, without knowing where the shooter is inside is risky, but they could have maneuvered a vehicle close to the building. They could have, used periscopes or these video scopes that, basically the end of some flexi stock, you could peer in a window and figure out where he is. I think something should have been happening that whole time. I share that suspicion with people, but I also understand that we have given cops an unsolvable puzzle. And if the idea is, look, the puzzle that we gave them means that they are on the hook for anything they do that doesn't go well, and they prioritize not doing, then the point is, well, that's on them because there were children and innocent teachers in that building, but it's also on the people who did that demonizing who should have seen this coming, right? So that's my point about the downsides of arguments. And
right, and into this environment, of course, we're losing police right and left. Not only are police departments being in some cases defunded, although behind the scenes, then a little bit more money is coming back into them. But many of the best cops either did not apply. The future best cops went not going into that field, or retired early, or yep, I'm out of here.
Or were driven out by mandates. And so the point is, we've done all kinds of things to reduce the effectiveness of our police. And now we're well, where the hell were the police? Well, it's well, have you been paying attention?
Yeah.
Right? Have you been paying attention over the last 2 years, what we've done to the police? Mm-hmm. Right? You don't think that played a role here? Because I do.